Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to see you again. I'm Carly from ICU DDR. It was a pleasure to get to meet some of you in person in Abu Dhabi, and we're so glad that all of you are with us again today. We have Dr. Pates for session 2 of Publishing Addiction Science. We are recording today's meeting, so if you need this afterwards, just let me know. Now go ahead and turn things over to Dr. Pates. Dr. Pates, just let me know when you want me to turn on your slides.
Yeah, let me just say about welcoming you. Excuse me, welcoming you all. It's lovely to see you. This I regard very much as an interactive session, so I want you to ask questions and interrupt and make comments. It's not just about me speaking. I also one of the things that we want you to do would be, if any of you are involved in research at the moment and you want to submit any papers or ideas that you're writing, so we can discuss them and help you at this point, because one of the things about writing papers, it's an ongoing process. So we'd be very grateful if you could send to Carly anything that you are working on at any time. And what we will do during this series of webinars, this is the second of 8. We will go through the process of writing the paper bit by bit. So today we're talking about writing the abstract and writing the introduction, and then we'll carry on until we finish the whole paper in 8 weeks time, or 8 sessions time, 6 sessions time. So shall we start? Have the first slides.
All right, let me get those going.
And these slides are certainly available for you. I mean, I'm very happy that you will have access to them, because on some of them there are email addresses that you may want, or web addresses. Okay, so this is about the introduction and methods. Oh, I thought it was abstract. Right, introduction and methods section. Next slide then, please, Carly.
Sorry, there's a little lag. There we go. I got it.
Right. Okay. What's the purpose of the introduction? And this is a very important part of your paper. And it's important to get it right, because too often people don't think enough about it and don't put the right stuff in it. So it's got 2 main functions. It introduces the topic of your research or review paper, by the end of which the introduction will have a stated aim. So you will describe what the situation is around the particular topic that you're working on, and you'll go towards narrow it down to the point of your research, and then you'll have an aim at the end of it. So this is what this research is about. The literature review provides the background for your work, discusses any controversies, and provides justification as to why you are doing it. And that's very important, because quite often when you get so involved in a subject, you understand it yourself, but your readers may not be so familiar with that. So it's worth justifying it, and this is why this is important. And if you can do that, it also helps the chances of publication, because you're telling the editor of the journal you're submitting to, this is an important piece of work, and it needs to be taken seriously. So next slide. Before you start, think about where you might submit your research, i.e. which journal, because there are, believe it or not, there are about 100 addiction journals in the world. And there's also, of course, we all come from different backgrounds. I'm a psychologist by profession, but in addiction, we are a really multidisciplinary group. We are nurses, doctors, social workers, sociologists, epidemiologists. So some people can submit to, I could submit to a psychology journal or an addiction journal. So think about where you're likely to, where it's best suited, and where you perhaps likely to get it published. And this is really important. Read the instructions to authors on the website. I mean, one of the things that I constantly go back to people is to say, have you read the instructions for authors? And that they're not difficult. but it's about things like style. It's about length of a paper, because usually journals will accept a paper of between 3,000 and 5,000 words. That's excluding the references and abstract and tables. But the thing is that all journals will have a page budget from their publishers. So you can't just keep writing. And if I publish lots of papers at 6,000 words, then I'm depriving someone else of the chance of getting published. So gives you an idea of the length of the paper they'll accept, usually between 3,000 and 5,000 words. This is important because it indicates how long your introduction should be. You don't want to start writing and then find out you run out of space. And that's actually quite important to think about the structure of the paper and what space you need to allocate to it. Check the required referencing style. And this again is important, because if it comes to my journal, it's the wrong referencing style, I'll send it back. Now, there are basically two styles. One is the Harvard or APA, American Psychological Association style, which is where you have the surname of the author in the text with a date, and then in the reference list you have the full reference. Or in the Vancouver style, where you just have a number against a quote or a point that you're making, and then in the reference section you have a numerical list in the order in which they're referenced in the reference list at the end. And as I say, if you use the wrong style, they'll send it back for corrections. And all journals use one or other of the style, but they'll never use both. So it's really important. It's a small detail, but it's important you get that right, and it saves you the frustration of having sent it back, changing it, and maybe it's going to the back of a queue and taking quite a long time to get published. Next slide. Now, your introduction. Don't simply describe the substance or the behavior being studied. Authors who see this as sufficient too often feel that the problem, substance, or behavior itself is what implies what research is needed. This is untrue. There should not be a volume of loosely related information making the reader feel lost and wonder what's all this information for. So as I said, one of the things that's very important about your introduction is that it's structured and it goes from the general to the specific, but also needs to include really to relate to what the problem is. Avoid archaic arguments that have been resolved or are not pertinent to your paper, even though you've spent months on this research and feel you have the answer. So when I started working in addiction, which is probably long before any of the rest of you, there was a big debate about harm reduction and whether we should have needle exchanges because of HIV and all this sort of thing. Those arguments have been resolved now and resolved in most countries, so it's not worth having those discussions, and that's true on many things. If you want to write about, for example, treatment of opioid problems, then substitute prescribing is now common throughout the world, and therefore, although that was a debate at one point, it's no longer worth having that discussion. And you also need to avoid statements like addiction is a major problem throughout the world, because we all know that it is. Just put in the relevant stuff and make it sort of lively and interesting. Next slide. So go from the general to the particular. So you introduce the topic and set it in context. And as I just said, avoid starting with the obvious statements. Drug use is a worldwide problem, as everyone will know this. And it is astonishing how many papers start with this, oh, it's about tobacco. Tobacco is a major killer throughout the world. Tobacco is a serious epidemic, this, that, and the other. We know that, and really it doesn't need to be in the paper. Topics should be introduced as being important, and you've spent time doing your research, so you know that it's important, but other people might not know why it's important. And it should be identified where the research is taking place. Sometimes I get papers and I search through the paper and I can't find out where this research has taken place. May not even know by country unless I go back and look for the country of the author that sent it. So it's always important to put it into the context of where it's taking place. And one of the reasons that is important is that there are very different cultural reasons or very different cultural aspects of substance use. If you were in China, for example, one of the major drug problems, or one of the major problems for in China, is the use of betel nut. It's a areca nut, which is chewed, and it's quite carcinogenic, and it causes some problems. Now, it is a problem that is entirely irrelevant in Britain because we don't see it. So cultural things are important, and so the context of where your research is taking place is important. End of your introduction will be the precise research question you're asking. So you start by introducing the topic generally and refine it down to the research question. And you must make sure the choice of literature quoted is balanced. Do not just reference work that is biased towards one view. If there is a dispute, then quote from both sides. And that is something that does happen. People either quote their own work too extensively, and that is bad because it looks as if there's people haven't read thoroughly, but they're just relying on their own research, or they have a view about what this research is about, and they'll only quote work that is biased towards one view. So it's important that there is a balance, and you have to remember that your work, when it's reviewed, will be reviewed by an experienced person, peer reviewer, and they will point that out. So it is actually important to get it right before you start. Next slide. Make sure that all the points you make are referenced. Do not make statements that are not backed up unless it is your speculation that leads to the point of the research. And one of the problems sometimes happens with inexperienced researchers is they make a lot of points, but they don't reference them. So you don't know, is this just the person's view, or is this a reference from someone that someone else has discovered? Make sure you quote the source accurately. That's a justification for your work. So don't just miss half the quote or misuse it. And it does, people do misuse quotes, and I've had that as the next point. I've had that myself. People making statements quoting me in papers I've written in the past, and stating the exact opposite of what I've said. So you need to be very careful about how you quote them. Don't use too many references for each point. It wastes space and makes the flow of the paper more difficult. And this is, as an editor, I sometimes find it really irritating. You're making a point and you see 4 or 5 references for each point, which seems to make the author having trouble justifying their point. So you know, if there is a point that is important you're making, 1 or at the most 2 is the best thing for that. So can we have the next slide? The literature review is a chapter in itself, and setting the context of the work of your research is very important. It should summarize only the most important references that lead directly to the understanding of the importance of your article and the methods used. Now, one of the things about science is that people very rarely start on researching on a subject which is completely unknown from that other people don't know about. So there's nearly always precedence to the work that you're doing. Someone has started doing this somewhere else. And I'm sure that even Albert Einstein, when he was writing the theory of relativity, had to reference other things from the past. So there's always a background to it. Sometimes it's not easy to find if you've chosen a very difficult subject, or if it's a subject that's very local to your area. It may not be, there may not be a lot of research. When I did my doctoral dissertation quite a long time ago, I did it on a subject called needle fixation, which is about where people become compulsive about injecting, and they get so obsessed with injecting, they'll inject water and all sorts of things. So the act of injecting is more important than the drug. And I could only find 1 reference to that, and that was about 25 years previously. So it's you sometimes have to think very carefully about what you're using, and use references that point to similarities. So it is important, but it's sometimes, you know, getting the right literature is important to get, so there is an understanding what the subject's about. Keep the topics of your literature review grouped, so the flow is logical and the reader does not have to move back and forward. So as I said, it should really be a flow that goes from the general to the specific, but also the topics within that flow should be grouped. So it is you know, you cover each subject and then move on to the next. So next slide. Common mistakes. Introduction is disorganized and does not flow from the general to the specific. And that is something which you will find improves with practice and is important to do. And it introduces issues that are, if you introduce issues that are irrelevant, and you sometimes see people doing that because they want to pad it out or make it seem more important, it should be related to the subject you're doing. Quotes too many references for each point, and I think I've discussed that you only need 1 or 2 references. And one of the things, as I said earlier, that if you have a lot of references, it really disrupts the flow of your reading. And I find this with papers that have so many references. You're reading a sentence and suddenly reference, and you almost lose the flow. Doesn't provide a balanced argument, ignoring papers that do not agree with your point of view. And that is, you know, as I said, that's really important. That there's often, and we work in a fairly, what's the word, a field that is quite political, and people agree and disagree. And certainly, one of the things that we understand, and one of the exciting things about working in addiction, is that it changes and it develops and it flows, but you need to make sure there is a balance of the arguments that the people are discussing. Papers are poorly referenced, that is a real difficulty. If it's too long, and sometimes I've found a paper that, you know, that 2/3 of it are the introduction and there's not enough room for the rest. And this last point is really important. Ask a colleague to read it, to check your perceptions of it are accurate. And I think this is something which is sometimes difficult when you're an early researcher, but I think is really important, because I have done this myself. I've found that I become so familiar with what I'm writing that I make mistakes. We all make mistakes, and you don't notice the mistakes when you reread it. And someone else will come along and say, "Oh, you know, you got that wrong." I know that when I did my doctoral dissertation, I made a fundamental error in something, and it was only through a colleague reading it through that I discovered the mistake before it was sent for examination. So it's really important that you do it, and don't be embarrassed about doing it, because it's something we should do for each other. And it's not about asking them whether it's good or not; it's asking them whether, you know, it's accurate. Next slide, please. The methods section. Now, this is again a really important section, and it describes how you have undertaken your research. So this includes the design of the study, who are the subjects, methods of analysis, statistics, etc., and why you've chosen these. And you also need to reference them. Should be clear and concise and enable someone else to replicate your study just from this method section. And that's really important. So if you read in the method section in a paper, could you go away and redo that study in your own field? Because if you can't, then the method section isn't clearly enough described. So next slide. Now, this holds true for both qualitative and quantitative papers and review papers. There are very different styles between these 3 different styles of paper, but they all need to have it all needs to be described so it can be replicated. When I started doing research, it was actually very hard to get qualitative papers published, because a lot of journals didn't take them. And I think they are incredibly important, because it's actually quite often you get the real reasons why certain things happen, and you're talking about lived experience of our clients. And one of the things that happens certainly in addiction is that we all think we know about it, but we actually we don't know as much as the people who've lived with the problem. And going back to my doctoral research, it was a mix, what they call a mixed method, so that it was qualitative and quantitative, and it was the qualitative side of it that helped me understand why people did this, and there was all sorts of reasons which then helped me develop the theory. But so it is important that you describe the methods. Qualitative methods are more difficult to write, but they still need to have a method there so people can replicate it. In reviews, how did you choose the paper you review? How did you choose the papers you reviewed? So if you're doing a review or a meta-analysis, you will quote the papers that you've reviewed, but also you will use a method to show how you've chosen those papers and not other papers. So you will have inclusion and exclusion criteria. In qualitative papers, the methodology will be different, but it still needs to be described, as I said. Next slide. The writing needs to be concise. This is a factual section, which is vital, but should be no longer than necessary. So if you find you've got a method section which is pages and pages long, it's usually too long. It should be just very brief, but very concise but very accurate. Where there are more unusual methods, these should be referenced, especially for qualitative papers, and as I said, these should always be done. Statistical tests should also be referenced, and it's interesting because these days, when I trained, and I know I'm an old git, but when I trained, it was very much that we learnt statistics manually. So we did them with a calculator. These days, of course, you get statistical programs on computers, but they should also be referenced and they should be accurately described. Next slide. Now, if some aspect of your design is suboptimal, i.e. that it's not perfect, explain it here and not in the limitations section. There is no such thing as a perfect paper, because there's always things people could say, oh yes, but you should have done this, you should have done that. If you say right at the beginning, then people can bear this in mind when reading the paper. So, for example, if you are talking about a population, but you've only managed to get male subjects, then you need to describe that and describe why you've only got male subjects, or if it's of an age group and that sort of thing. So it's really important that you, if you do highlight the limitation there, then people will respect that and will read the paper bearing that in mind. And I find sometimes that I receive papers that don't explain that and think they can get away with it. So I have to write back and say, you need to actually clarify why you've only got males in this or this group or that group. For your population, for the subjects, describe them how they were selected. For example, if they were recruited from one town, you should mention this. And that again is something where there is it's very important, because I know my country, as you know your countries, but I also know that certain places are very different from other places. So central London is very different from a place in rural Wales where I live, and you need and it has different habits, different populations, so that you need to describe that. Describe why you chose the size of your studied population. And there are for quantitative studies there are statistics that you can use to get the right estimate of the size of the population you need. For qualitative studies, one of the things that people quite often do, and I hope we'll do qualitative work later, but you use something called saturation, where if you're interviewing people, and you reach 15 people and you find the next 3 people are all saying the same thing, and you've got nothing new coming out, then you've reached saturation. So that's the sort of thing that you need to mention. And next slide. In a review study, use the PRISMA, preferred reporting systems for preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, the process to guide your flow of papers you've selected. Now, that reference, Publishing Addiction Science, would have been a slide in the first session of this series of webinars, and it's a book that's published by the Organization of Addiction Journal Editors, International Society of Addiction Journal Editors, and you can get these chapters free online from the Ice Age website, and perhaps we can make sure that we put that on there again next time. And there is a diagram of how this works. So there's a very for review studies, it's a very useful way of flowing through to saying why you selected these studies and which ones you rejected and why you rejected and what you ended up with in the end, to describe your source of material. State which sources, databases or indexes from which you've selected your papers. There's one time, again, before the widespread use of computers, you'd have to go to a library and go through books to find who were the relevant papers. These days, of course, you go to search engines, whether you use an academic one like Athens or Google or whatever, but you can find the papers. But if you put in the subject of your research, you'll find the papers related to that. But you need to cite that so people can follow that through. And don't forget, the thing about the method section is always about someone being able to replicate what you've done. The next slide. In randomized control trials, explain how you randomize the subject. And it's often not explained. So people need to know how you randomized it, so that there's not a bias in this. And usually, it can be a way of doing it with alternative people that come through, or allocating them numbers or whatever, but make sure you explain it. Use CONSORT, Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials, for reporting random controlled trials. And there you see a website there, and these are recommended for reporting randomized controlled trials. And if you do that, you'll again stand a better chance of getting it published. Next slide. If your study is a control trial, you need to explain the inclusions and exclusion criteria for the study. It's funny because sometimes I get papers that talk about young people smoking, for example, and then you'll find that they've included people up to the age of 40. Now, I don't regard the age of 40 as being young, especially the age I am now, but it's important that those inclusions and exclusions are explained exactly. Again, ask a colleague to read through your method section and say, do they understand it? Could you replicate it? Could you take that away and do it yourself again? Next slide.
Like I'm locked up here. Give me just a second. It usually responds after a minute. Dr. Pates, are you still able to hear me?
Yeah, still here. Yeah,
Okay.
maybe that's the last slide, is it? I'm not sure. Oh no, here we are.
No, I don't
Yep.
think so. So we just looked at this one, and
Yep.
our next slide. No.
That was one before. Yeah.
Are we maybe at the end of our slide? Let me just take a look. We are.
We are. Anyway, so that's really a discussion on the introduction and the method section, and I hope it was fairly clear. If you have any questions or thoughts, then now is our time to discuss them. as I said, what I'll do next time I presentation, we'll make sure that we have a web address for this book. Now, this is a book called Publishing Addiction Science, and it is published by. It's a very good book because it's very clear on laid out about how you publish your work, and a lot of my work on these webinars is based on that. And it's what I say, it's free of charge from the whole book. You wouldn't get the whole book free of charge because it's about 300 pages. But you can you can get it eventually, all but you'd download the chapter that you wanted at any time, and that's a really important resource for this course.
And Dr. Pates, I did send that link, and I'll send it again with the follow-up email.
Thanks very much, Carly. So, are you any of you in the middle of research now?
Oh.
Chitsanzo. And is there anything that you want to talk about with regard to the research?
Hello.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello?
Okay. I'm working on a project which we are looking at the implementation of screening, brief intervention, and referral treatment, but especially for tobacco. So I think we're expecting some papers out of that project as well.
That's great. That's great. Well, one of the things that we can help you with on this course, if you are beginning to start writing anything and you want us to look at it and help you with it, we'd be very happy to do that. I mean, I don't know. The other thing I was going to say that I should have done on this thing, and I'm sorry if I didn't, is to put my email address, and I think it was on the first series. But if Carly could send that out as well, and I'm happy for you to contact me individually if you want to have questions to ask or observations to make. I'm very happy for that. Now that goes throughout the course. I mean, as I said, I see this as an interactive course that we are. It's not always easy with the technology, but we are working together on this. Working together.
All right. Thanks. I think I'll reach out to discuss more.
Please do. I'll be very happy to help in that. And as I said, one of the things that we hope that you'll do is all of you to do is to submit ideas of some of your research if you want us to discuss it and help. One of the things that I've learned through many years of working in I basically was a treatment psychologist, but I've always done research, is being able to discuss it with people, because it often they can point out perhaps faults in it or recommend ways of doing this, that, and the other, and it's really helpful. So I see this as your opportunity to have a forum where you can discuss things, and you will not be you'll be thought the better of if you do. Has anyone any other points that they want to make about this? I'm not sure, Carly, whether people don't have anything to say or whether there's problems with the technology. If we don't have anything more to say, there's no point in you sitting around quietly. But as I say, I'm slightly concerned if whether the technology is working properly. And
Well, I think we're working okay. I can see that Chitsana was muted, but he unmuted himself to speak. Farida, are you working on any research? Well, we do, often have times people who drop off. So I saw that we did lose one person, and that's usually, places that just don't have great infrastructure for internet, and we understand that.
well, so I won't keep you if there's nothing else to say, but I'll make it slightly longer next session. Perhaps we can do that.
So just to note a few things as we went, I'll send all the slides. I'll send a reminder to send documents, right? Because that's what we really want. We want some folks to share their research so that we can all learn together. A link to the recording once I have it, another link to the textbook. And Dr. Pates, you mentioned the Prisma under the methods system, method section, which is chapter 9 of the book. So I'll
Yeah,
include that. And then also this website, consortstatements.org.
yeah,
And then I'll include your email as well.
that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Carly.
Very good. Well, we appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much for joining. What we'll do, we had more folks when we started, and I understand sometimes people have other commitments, Dr. Pate, so we'll just continue to send the emails to the whole group who signed up. So if we had some folks who couldn't join for session 2, that's okay. They can come back and join for session 3.
Yeah, and if they have all the slides, even if they've missed a session, they'll have that. And as I say, I'm very happy for anyone to contact me at any point by email, either during the course or when the course is finished. I see this as being something important for all of us.
Oh, there's Dr. Gladys. Hello, Dr. Gladys. We were just inviting people to please share research that you're working on, and I'll make sure that you have a contact email to do that. All right, well, I'll go ahead and stop recording.